He's back.
He is.
We know what a Trump presidency looks like. So can world leaders be confident in how to work with Donald Trump?
Well, we know what Trump presidency the first time around looks like. This one's going to be different, I think. He is more secure in his own instincts. He has less constraints on the policy advisors that he has around him. It's very clear that by the end, he was prioritizing loyalty over experience, particularly those who have experience who disagreed with him. So it's not just the president, but the cabinet is going to look, I think, quite different than it did before. We're still waiting to hear, at the time of taping here, what the House looks like. But there is a real possibility that you'll have Republican control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, which is a fundamentally different composition than last time around. Your question, I think, though, was about can leaders be confident that they know how to deal with this? Well, they know what dealing with Trump is like, that's for sure, but he will be much more secure in how he sees things. But one of the things that I think we really have to fasten on and that all leaders will be thinking of is Trump will look different in 2024 than he did in 2016. Not only is he older himself, but again, feels very vindicated this time around. And on top of all that, the world looks extraordinarily different in 2024 than it does in 2016, where things were calmer, then we see many more disruptions now, which adds a whole different layer of complexity for how both allies and adversaries of the United States are going to attempt to navigate forward and exploit this moment.
So what will be the main concern for European leaders?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious because Trump has said consistently that he doesn't think that NATO pays its fair share, NATO members on this. Now, again, we're at a different moment in 2024 than we were in 2016 or 2020. Back in 2020, when Trump left the White House, only 9 of 30 NATO member states were paying 2% of their GDP to defense. Now we have 23 of 32 members. The spending has gone up. They are doing more, but whether or not it's enough is, I think, the open question here.
Do you think he may actually withdraw the US from the NATO alliance?
Well, it's unclear. His advisors, or certainly those who support his view, say consistently that this is a negotiating tactic. But Trump himself says something a little bit different, that if you don't pay what he terms fair payment, therefore the protection, as he terms the alliance, is over. We can also look at the words of his former national security advisor, John Bolton, who said that on more than one occasion, Trump was actually on the precipice of withdrawing from NATO. So, look, Trump prides himself on being unpredictable and not being clear about what his endpoints are because he can always negotiate further. On this, as on a number of other things, I think the truth is we do not know, but the volatility will have real effect and will have real effect on allied capitals.
You may have just answered this, but if you had to sum it up, how would you characterize Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy?
Unpredictable, personalized, and tariffs, because I think he said all three of those things matter enormously to him.
We're nearly 3 years now into Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine. Is this election result the worst case scenario for Ukraine?
Well, it's certainly not the best case from Ukraine's perspective, especially if we're talking in terms of Ukraine's ability to fight with more weaponry, making sure that there's a broad alliance led by the United States in supporting them, and making sure that they can push back not only against strikes within Russia, but also making sure that they can regain some of the territory that they've lost. Now, consistently, Donald Trump has said that he wants this war over, that he will end it on day one. That may or may not be true. He doesn't get to decide for the Ukrainians themselves. But I think, in terms of your question about the worst possible outcome, the question begins to be, is Ukraine going to be negotiating from a position of strength or one where they are undercut in what they have been doing?
And if Donald Trump were to pull US support from Ukraine and Vladimir Putin wins some Ukrainian territory, I mean, what message does that send to other dictators?
Well, this is a really important question you've brought up because consistently what we hear from several of the advisors within the Trump orbit is that the reason that Donald Trump is not a fan of what's happening in Ukraine, i.e. the Ukrainians fighting back against Russia, is because the Europeans need to handle this. The Ukrainians need to do this on their own, and America cannot afford to take its eye off the ball of the most important strategic competition, which is in Asia and against China. Now, that might well be true, but there's, I think, a larger question here that if Russia wins, if there are perceived wins for this, what is the message that Xi Jinping takes for this, for deterrence? What is the message that European leaders, who increasingly have been working with their counterparts in the Indo-Pacific region, take for their willingness to do more in the Indo-Pacific region when they have a bigger problem in Europe itself? So I actually think there are a lot of complexities to this, and it's not nearly as clear-cut as the rhetoric we've heard.
Would Xi Jinping be celebrating or commiserating today?
I think Xi Jinping's outcome, all the analysis that we've seen of how China is looking at the U.S. Election, is there are dangers on both sides because it is really a bipartisan focus about the threat represented by China. There are problems with the Harris presidency, had she won. There are problems with the Trump presidency. However, I think the part that would be cheering for Xi Jinping is the chaos factor inside the United States, and the United States in coordination with its allies and partners is likely to go up. The United States being willing to push back across the board in a broad-fronted multinational coalition is going to become more difficult. I think those are cheering prospects for Xi Jinping, even though he will have sizable challenges dealing with the Trump administration.
Yeah, Trump's messaging on China has been so mixed. I mean, China's scared of me, I'm going to put all these tariffs, but then at the same time, they could well benefit from chaos.
Well, they could well benefit from chaos. I don't think there's any argument on that. But we also know that the more assertive set of American policies against China really ramped up under the first Trump administration. We know he has a number of advisors who pushed that, and Trump seemed to believe portions of that. Now, the devil is in the details, of course, because what are we talking about with Taiwan? How much support for them? How much Taiwan is a bargaining chip? What are we talking about in terms of technological competition? What are we talking about in terms of a broad-fronted multinational coalition against human rights abuses that China has had? Some of those, I think we know the answer to already. But on other fronts, particularly the trade war front, Trump has talked about a 20% tariff on anyone unless your name rhymes with China, and then it goes up to 60%. The way that that plays out, how long that can be pursued, is, I think, another facet that we just don't know the outcome to right now.
Is the Indo-Pacific less secure with Donald Trump in the White House?
Look, Trump's advisors would tell you that strength, which is what Donald Trump represents, equals deterrence. Therefore, the Indo-Pacific is more secure. When I speak with friends around the region, there's a different story that's told too, that some of the more assertive aspects of U.S. policy under Donald Trump presidency make them more secure. A robust American approach to its military and defense spending, a more confrontational approach occasionally against China. But there are other aspects of that which make them fundamentally less sure of America's commitment to the region, nor its staying power in the region, or even its influence. So I think the questions multiply rapidly across the Indo-Pacific region. And frankly, because there's a more transactional nature that takes place under Donald Trump, the questions abound for the entire region, as you said. So if there is hard negotiations with the South Koreans, what does that imply for Japan's security? If there are negotiations with the two of those, what does it imply for the Philippines' security? And what does that imply for Australia's security? There are large questions that it's myopic to just take one at a time because it's an entire regional focus that will continue to evolve here.
You spend a lot of time in Canberra. I mean, the Albanese government obviously being very diplomatic about the prospect of working with President Trump. What are they really thinking and saying?
First of all, we know that Prime Minister Albanese has come out to congratulate Donald Trump, as well he should. They're going to work with a U.S. administration of any stripe. Allies do that.
But are they worried?
Of course they're worried. Of course they're concerned. When there are question marks in front of you that you don't know the answer to, that you don't know the outcome of, and you don't know what your partner will do, that's when questions multiply. That's true across the board when we talk about trade, when we talk about climate, when we talk about defense issues. It's also especially true when we talk about really signature initiatives such as AUKUS, where there's not a no here from the Trump camp. There are just many more questions than I think they would have had otherwise.
Trump is isolationist, America first. Do you see his stance impacting or changing the AUKUS deal at all?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that there are a lot of different camps within Trump world. I know you asked me about Trump himself. But let's note that at least in the first term, and you're likely to see less of those, there are more internationalist advisors. They're in a distinct minority now, but they still exist. There are those who claim that they are Asia firsters, right? They care less about what's happening in the Middle East, less about what's happening in Ukraine, because they want to really focus on pushing China across the board. And then there are those who are more America firsters, more isolationists. I think watching who gets cabinet appointments will tell us a little bit of those, because actually it's somewhat hard to place Donald Trump in any one of those categories, other than I think we can say he's not an internationalist. He is hawkish on China. Sometimes he's bullish on China when it comes to trade deals. So it's unclear, not to mention that we now have Elon Musk in the mix, too, as a very different perspective on working with China. Now, again, sorry, I pushed back on your question about what Donald Trump is, but you had asked that about AUKUS, right? And I think the question is, Donald Trump is, at his core, very transactional. He's not going to do something unless he thinks, A, it benefits the United States, but really if it benefits him and his political standing. So AUKUS can be caged in a lot of different ways. If that pitch is demonstrated, if it helps advance the U.S. submarine industrial base in addition to Australia's, that strikes me as a better sell. It's one that the Australian government is already pursuing with them. But again, I don't think it's a done deal. It's just one that needs to be prosecuted at a personal level at this point.
He loves a good deal and he loves to project military strength. So those things, I guess, would tick the boxes as far as AUKUS is concerned.
They would. Again, there's an enormous investment by Australia into the U.S. Submarine industrial base, no less into the U.K. submarine industrial base. There is the work of enlarging America's footprint in Australia. These are things that could benefit both parties here, but the question is, how is that argument going to be made, and how much salience does it have to Donald Trump?
America, though, is struggling to build its own nuclear submarines. I mean, wouldn't Trump be more concerned about hitting domestic targets before supplying Australia?
Absolutely, he is, as any president would be. The United States Congress gives requirements for the United States in terms of global posture, what it needs to have globally, because of course the United States has a presence globally. The United States, as you rightly point out, is not hitting its targets currently of how many submarines it's producing. The better question, though, is not therefore Australia won't get any. The question is, how do we get to more, and more for everyone? I think AUKUS, personally, I think AUKUS is probably the best way that you get there, but that's an argument to be prosecuted for how we get to more assets for both the United States and for Australia and others.
And maybe now the timeline changes with Trump in charge. I mean, is that a possibility? If he wants to prioritise American production?
Maybe. I mean, these things take a really long time to build. The investments by Australia and by the United States have already taken place and are ramping up. I mean, there's going to be a heated debate here about just how high the U.S. defense budget will go under Trump. I don't see a change in the timeline to the first several steps of AUKUS, including the submarine rotational force out in Perth that's going to be set up by 2027. But in terms of production, the question that will be before the American president is, at the moment when a U.S. president is ready to certify the transfer to Australia of the SSNs, whether or not the United States has enough that are in its inventory that have been gotten underway too. So that's a question that probably won't come down the line for several years and into the early 2030s.
Just turning to the Middle East, how critical is the US president to brokering peace between Israel and Gaza?
The United States obviously has a role to play here, but it's not the only actor here, nor is it necessarily an actor that can force a resolution on the parties here. So there is agency here, but also what happens in Israel, what happens in Iran, what happens in Lebanon, what happens in Gaza will all play a factor.
Benjamin Netanyahu describes Trump as the best friend he's ever had in the White House. I mean, how likely is Donald Trump to pressure Israel to stop the atrocities in Gaza?
Well, we've heard more than one thing on this. So on the one hand, less likely, I think we can say, that he told Netanyahu, as we've seen, that he should do what he has to do. And I think much of the assessment is that there won't be much pressure on Israel to rein itself back, particularly with the cabinet shuffles that we've even seen with Netanyahu taking more power in Israel. On the other hand, Trump has said that he wants this war over and done with by the time he gets into office. How that resonates, whether or not that affects Netanyahu's decision-making, I think is still to be seen.
I think one of the problems is he makes these statements and claims without a lot of detail. So, for example, I'll end the war in Ukraine on day one. I mean, what does that look like? What could that look like?
Well, it's not just on that front. It's true on his healthcare plan. It's true on his Middle East plan. It's true with his defense budget plan. It's true on his climate plan. There are not details. That was not the pitch that he was giving, other than to say he can fix everything. Now, in terms of your particular question, what would it look like? Again, it would probably mean a lot more pressure on Ukraine to settle, to renounce its claims to its own territory. But again, the United States cannot make peace for Ukraine, so that is a decision that will be made in Kyiv, not in Washington.
So, are we just in the great unknown now, a period of great uncertainty?
Well, we are in the transition period, but we're also in a period of great uncertainty as for what happens after January 20th in 2025, because we're in a brave new world here. Amongst other things, the world is just fundamentally that much more uncertain. The stability of the world looks much more fragile than it did 8 years ago. At this point, there's not the prospect of conflict. There's real conflict happening in not one, but at least two, if not more places in the world at this point. So the uncertainty factor has gone up, and the fact that we have very little clarity on the policies that will be pursued, except in the broadest of broad strokes, means that, yes, there is more uncertainty at this point, and we're likely to have to live with that.
What do you say to people who say it feels like the world's ending? Could we see World War III? These are very real concerns.
Look, let me take the latter question first. Could we see World War III? We are edging ourselves towards a much more confrontational world than we have seen at any point in the last 7 decades. The prospect for not only conflict, but metastasizing conflict in multiple parts of the world is larger than it has been at almost any point that we can remember. That whether or not that means World War III is an open question.
But a terrifying one.
But a terrifying one. What I would say, though, is countries have agency in this, both preparing themselves, thinking about what they need in a much more contested world, in a much more uncertain world. Countries, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, the United States, all have the ability to shape their own decisions and not just become hostages of fortune. This wasn't your question, but what do we say for, is the world ending? The world is not ending. If you are a supporter of an America deeply engaged in the world that champions freedom, today looks darker than it did yesterday. There is no doubt about that. But what the future might bring, we have to take one day at a time. And we have to take deep breaths and make sure that countries and people and individuals are all making decisions that make sense as they move forward.
And he was president before, and the world didn't end, although it felt like it sometimes.
He was president before. The world did not end. But we did see advances taken by China, taken by Russia, taken by North Korea during his presidency. Trump has an affinity towards authoritarian leaders. There is no doubt about that. He likes the trappings of power. He likes the back and forth of great power politics. The question, I think, is whether or not we'll see ourselves over the next several years in a world where those actors who are destabilizing the entire world will continue to see this as a period of uncertainty, of chaos, and of churn that they can move forward their own interests, or whether or not they'll be thrown for a loop in this more chaotic approach to U.S. foreign policy.
What should Australia be most worried about? What would be the greatest concern to the Australian government?
Look, the greatest concern to the Australian government is, we should say our concerns are twofold. Number one, America that's simply less engaged, that's less invested, that's less present, not only with Australia, but across the entire region. That's a concern for Australia for security purposes, for normative value purposes, even for trading purposes. So as America talks a big game, but potentially withdraws itself militarily, that's a concern for Canberra, I think. So the question becomes what they can do both on their own and in order to convince Americans to stay as firmly anchored as possible. The more discrete set of policies, I think, become on all the initiatives that the United States and Australia have started over the last several years, whether it's defense posture, whether or not it's AUKUS, whether or not it's the Climate and Critical Minerals and Clean Energy Compact, whether or not those initiatives are likely to accelerate forward, kind of tread water, or just be blown up entirely.
As an American, how do you feel about the future of your country?
Look, as an American who deeply believes in America's value and importance in the world, and for all the problems that that can create in the world and domestically, that the world is fundamentally safer, more secure, more prosperous, and more democratic with a fully invested America. This is a moment where I think we have a lot of questions about what that looks like, no less what America itself will look like moving forward.
Hello, I'm Amelia Adams. Thanks for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our extra minute segments and full episodes of 60 Minutes on 9now.com.au and the 9Now app.